Know, O Prince, that between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Ares, there was an age undreamed of, when shining cities lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath the stars. Nemedia, Ophir, Brithannia, Hyperborea, Zamora, with its dark-haired women and towers of spider-haunted mystery, Zingara with its chivalry, Koth that bordered on the pastoral lands of Shem, Stygia with its shadow-guarded tombs, Hicernia, whose riders wore steel and silk and gold. But the proudest kingdom of the world was Aquilonia, reigning supreme in the dreaming west. Hither came Conan, the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet. Let's talk about Conan the Barbarian. In the December 1932 edition of Weird Tales magazine was a small story called The Phoenix on the Sword. And while Farnsworth Wright, the editor of Weird Tales, who is credited with making the magazine as monumental as it was, he described it as having points of excellence, it wasn't considered good enough to make the cover story, so it really came in without much fanfare. But that was the story that introduced us to the character Conan of Cimmeria, also known today as Conan the Barbarian. But I want to be very clear, if your only experience with Conan so far is either the 80s Schwarzenegger movies or even the god-awful 2011 movie with Jason Momoa, which, my god, what a waste of perfect casting. Or maybe you've read the Marvel comics or the Dark Horse comics, you haven't necessarily had a proper introduction to Conan. Robert E. Howard is, without a doubt, he's one of my favorite authors. And it breaks my heart the way the Conan legacy has been so watered down, especially by stuff like John Milieu's 80s movie with Schwarzenegger, wherein the Conan character had to be reduced because he was so set on casting Arnold Schwarzenegger, despite the fact Schwarzenegger doesn't even look the part. But Schwarzenegger couldn't speak English. So the language of the stories, which is incredibly rich and intelligent, had to be reduced. Another thing that I absolutely... I don't understand John Milieu's idea to take a child Conan, put him in slavery for 20 years, and then try to claim that this character is still Conan the Barbarian. Because you can't have a barbarian if they've been broken by 20 years of slavery. And no explanation of the Wheel of Pain, the device that Conan is hooked up to, well, not hooked up to, is bound to in the movie, that it builds his strength and it builds his stubbornness. No, it doesn't make sense. It's a complete betrayal of what the character is. Conan as a character is extremely intelligent, coming down from the savage north into the more civilized south, learning and traveling his way through all these kingdoms until the day that he becomes king in Aquilonia, which is regarded as the greatest kingdom of all at the time. And it bothers me so much that the Schwarzenegger version is what most people know about Conan. So many people, whenever I say, oh, I read the Conan stories, they come at me with what is actually a Genghis Khan quote, saying, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. That's not Conan. In Queen of the Black Coast, one of the greatest short stories in the Conan mythos, well, I don't know if I can call it the mythos. I'll call it the Conan canon. Because, yeah, let's go with the Conan canon. But In Queen of the Black Coast, he tells Belit, who is his first great love, that his ethos in life is I eat, I slay, I love, I am content, which is completely different from crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. One of the few things the 2011 movie got right was the fact that, well, they use Conan's actual ethos with the I eat, I slay, I love. And it's so fundamental to the character because that scene in Queen of the Black Coast, it's like in a musical when you have the, not necessarily I want song, but the song that establishes who the character is. It's his philosophy in life. And if you change that, like John Milius did for his movies, you fundamentally change the character. And at that point, it's not an adaptation anymore because you've completely missed the point. And to be fair, I don't know if Milius missed the point or if he just thought he knew better, because in the story of the Conan, in the meta history of Conan and what goes on behind the scenes, the idea of someone else knowing better is unfortunately a recurring theme. Howard really only wrote Conan for about 3 years. So Robert E. Howard was born in 1906 and unfortunately died of suicide in 1936. So he only lived for 30 years. And as I said, the first Conan story was published in 1932. And by the end of his life, well, he had stopped writing Conan stories, but we don't really know if that was because he was done with the character or if it was because Weird Tales owed him $30, which you hear that nowadays, $30 is almost nothing. But let's remember, it was the Great Depression. $30 was worth a considerable amount. And the fact that they couldn't or wouldn't pay him would of course stop him from publishing with Weird Tales. So instead he would focus on writing his historical and action stories, like his boxing character Steve Costigan. I believe that's right. I haven't actually read the rest of the boxing stories because I've been more interested in the fantasy. But of course he would focus on writing those stories, which would actually get him money. Because one thing about Howard is I praise Howard. His writing is absolutely fantastic. But he went where the money was. He would write his stories based on what would get him the most money. As a perfect example, I mentioned that Phoenix on the Sword wasn't considered good enough to make the cover story. Back in the days of the pulp magazines, being the cover story was extremely important, because if your story stood out to the editor, then they would choose to commission an artist to make the cover based on that story. That's fairly obvious. The thing is, that author then got a pay bonus because their story made it to the cover. And Weird Tales especially, it was all about scandalization. And that is why so many of their covers had scantily clad women, women in distress, terrifying monsters. And Howard wanted that bonus. So his stories in many cases were tailored to suit that idea. He included the scantily clad damsels. He included hints of lesbianism, which at the time was extremely scandalous, but also appealing in a dark way, which in some cases it still is today. It's a taboo fantasy that men especially are drawn to. So that's a recurring theme in his stories. However, H.P. Lovecraft once described Howard's writing as greater than any money-making scheme he could concoct, because even when he was writing to that formula, and even when he was focused on trying to make more money and to have his stories appeal, they're still very good. His writing is still beautiful. And yes, you can see a difference in quality between some stories. For example, Queen of the Black Coast, Red Nails are considered to be some of the greatest stories in the Conan canon because they are some of the best. Others are a bit more formulaic, and the writing he was writing for a monthly release schedule. There's only so much editing you can do in that time. But even so, the writing rises above that. And it's so good. And I enjoy it so much. And I wish more people would read the Conan stories, which is part of why I'm here today talking about this. Because it does break my heart that so many of these stories now get overlooked because people have such a poor impression of Conan from the movies. And I respect Frank Frazetta as an artist. His work was incredible, but he was also the one who created the image of Conan in the loincloth, which was never accurate to the books. Every story, I say books, but the thing is, it really is mostly short stories. There was only one novel by the standards of the time, which would be considered short and probably considered a novella today. But even so, in all these short stories, as Conan travels between the different kingdoms, each story sees him in a different form of armor and in a different set of clothing, which is something Howard did as world building, so you could understand a bit about the land where Conan was at the time. And it's subtle, but it's so well done, and it's something that I wish more writers would be aware of nowadays. Because I see so many writers who it's like their world building, it doesn't tell me anything. If you put your I'm holding my cup like it's a microphone. But if you put your dragon riders in basic leather armor with no description of what it actually looks like, that doesn't tell me anything about the world your riders live in. I'm looking at you, Rebecca Yarros. But that's another topic that I probably will talk about another time. But the point is, the Conan stories deserve so much more credit than they have nowadays. And I really wish more people would give them a chance. So, really quick, maybe you're interested in learning more about Conan. Maybe you want to actually check them out. So, really quick rundown. Del Rey? I've mixed this up before. Yes, it is Del Rey. So, Del Rey released a complete set of Howard's stories, which is, well, this is the Conan set. I don't have Cull of Atlantis. I don't have any of the others. All I have right now is Conan. But the 3-volume set with The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian, The Conquering Sword of Conan, and The Bloody Crown of Conan. And they collect Howard's original manuscripts. So after Howard's death, unfortunately, some people thought they could do better. And so they took Howard's unfinished stories, or ones that had even been rejected by Weird Tales, and they rewrote them. They took stories that Howard had written that weren't even supposed to be about Conan and put Conan's name on it, and began selling it as Robert E. Howard and so-and-so. And then, of course, that led to the pastiche market, which is actually where we got the Frank Frazetta art. Again, I have immense respect for Frank Frazetta as an artist, but I hold a grudge for creating that Conan image because it's so inaccurate to the books. And even Frazetta's children have admitted that he read almost none of the books that he drew covers for. The exception is pretty much Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan. Everything else, he probably just got a description from the publishers and just drew whatever he wanted from there. And there is, of course, he loved The Lord of the Rings and did a set of Lord of the Rings illustrations, but I don't know if those were ever actually used officially, because the Tolkien fans did not like it. Anyway, back to Conan. But yeah, I look at stories like Queen of the Black Coast, which is absolutely one of the best, which is Conan in his younger years. Not at his youngest. It's generally believed that Tower of the Elephant sees Conan at the youngest when he first comes down from Cimmeria in the north. But Queen of the Black Coast is just a work of art. It's so well done. Even for a short story, obviously it can't dwell too much on things. But Belit is one of Conan's great loves. And that's another thing I resent about the 80s movies, is the fact that they tried to make Valyria, who, she's a fling. Even in the book, even in Red Nails, Valyria and Conan both know it's a fling. They're just having fun. But the movies took Valyria and tried to say, oh, she was Conan's first great love, the one who inspired him and whose memory he could never forget. No, that was my girl Belit, Queen of the Black Coast, the pirate queen who run around half naked, trying to bend history to her will and claiming that the god Conan worshipped actually came from the pantheon of her own people because she couldn't bear the idea for Conan to worship a god that wasn't part of her pantheon. Because she wanted everything to be the way she wanted it to be, and she wanted Conan to have another connection to her because she loved him in her own, it's not even in her own way. She absolutely loved him, and Conan loved her as well. But at the same time, she was an extremely selfish person who, well, she was a spoiled brat in a way. I've described Belit as the toxic power fantasy in a way, that the fantasy toxic woman, where it's like, she's toxic, she's not a great person, but she's still so much fun and you still love her because that's Belit. She's just that much fun. Whereas Conan's final his final great love was his queen, Zenobia, who is from the only actual novel that Robert A. Howard wrote, and Zenobia, God, Zenobia is so good. I love Belit and Zenobia. I don't think I could even decide which one I like more because they're so different. But Zenobia comes in, she rescues Conan. She impresses him with her knowledge of being able to give him a weapon he can use and a horse he can actually ride rather than giving him some lady's mare. And at the end of that story, he rescues her, choosing her as his queen, which, it's the final line of the novel. And so, sorry to spoil it, but the novel is called The Hour of the Dragon. And The Hour of the Dragon was not published by Weird Tales. It was actually published by a publisher in the UK. And since Weird Tales didn't usually make it across the pond, they approached Howard and said, hey, we want to bring your Conan here. Could you write a novel that could be an introduction to our readers over here? And so he did. He wrote The Hour of the Dragon, which if you read it alongside the other stories, you can see a lot of repeating elements. Even the Phoenix on the Sword, the first story, you can see some elements repeated in The Hour of the Dragon. But it's still unique. And it's, like I said, a lot of what he did was the scantily clad girls to get on the cover. But that doesn't change the fact that Howard wrote some incredible female characters. Even the variety among the girls Conan has pretty much each story still makes them unique. You have, like I said, Belit and Zenobia, his great loves, who are still completely different. You have Yasmina, who is... she's another fling, really. That's what it is. But she's still a fascinating character. And Valyria, while I don't consider her one of Conan's true loves, she's still a great character. She's a fascinating swordswoman. And she's very well done. And I wish it got more credit. And look, these stories were written in the 1930s. There's no denying that there are certain aspects to the language in particular that don't really pass the sniff test today, that people would consider what's the right phrase? Controversial. I guess there is some racialized language. But I think it's important to remember that, again, these were the 1930s. Howard, for the time, was considered to be extremely liberal. And if you actually research Lovecraft beyond what people like to talk about, just, oh, he was incredibly racist, you discover that over time, as Lovecraft was exposed to more of the world and taken away from the upper class New England background that he had grown up with, his mind changed. And over time, he began to realize that, oh, well, mostly because friends like Howard would tell him, dude, other races are not inferior to you just because they're different. And so Lovecraft, I have to say Lovecraft because his first name was actually Howard. But so Lovecraft did learn over time, and I wish more people would give him credit for that. I've had people tell me that it doesn't matter and that there's no forgiveness because he was raised to be racist. If that's how you see the world, that's heartbreaking. That is a tragic way to live. But getting back to Robert E. Howard, Howard was credited with helping Lovecraft overcome his racism. Lovecraft described him as a liberal of his time, and because H.P. Lovecraft was the one who wrote his obituary that appeared in Weird Tales magazine after his death. And I don't think Lovecraft was ever the same after that, unfortunately. Lovecraft's life was a fucking tragedy when you actually look into it. Just constant loss and constant pain and misery. Anyway, but actually that brings me to something else I want to bring up is, because I'm gushing about Robert E. Howard as much as I am just Conan at this point. But it's so fascinating to look at how, so Robert E. Howard is credited with creating sword and sorcery, which thanks to that, we have things like D&D and so many of these other fantasy staples today. And while H.P. Lovecraft is credited with creating cosmic horror, but Howard wrote plenty of horror of his own, enough to fill several collections, I believe. And it's so interesting to see the difference, because H.P. Lovecraft, it's New England, so his world was foggy and moldy and wet, and everything was seeping and spreading. Whereas Howard was from Texas, so his horror is a lot of reptiles and sand and desert and dry rot as opposed to the creeping mold. And Howard's stories also had more hope, I feel. You see his heroes, who tend to be more action-oriented. Let me check my hair. It's a mess. Howard's characters tended to be more action-oriented, whereas Lovecraft's were very much scholars who fell down a hole and became obsessed with the dark elements they began to study, whereas Robert E. Howard's characters tended to be more, like I said, more brawn rather than brain. And in a way, they have better instincts. So when the cosmic horror comes out of its tomb, they have enough sense to look away and not see it and not go mad, but they hear it slither back into its tomb before they know, okay, they're safe now, they can turn around and run the other direction. But they're able to escape madness because they have enough sense not to look at the terrifying thing and not to get pulled into eons of ancient mythos and that drives men mad. They're both great. I want to be clear. Like, I'm not criticizing Lovecraft. His writing is also great. But I love the contrast. I love the idea that these two men were so different, but were so similar. So when they wrote, even in the same genre, and even when Howard wrote stories that are considered part of the Cthulhu mythos, they're still so different because it's such a unique signature. And it comes back to this idea, that's write what you know. You know, some people, they try to reduce the idea of write what you know to, oh, you can only write your exact life experience. But that's not what it means. Write what you know is, it's not, oh, you can't write fantasy because you've never actually seen a dragon or anything like that. It's working with what you know. It's writing an environment that you're familiar with. But anyway, but yeah, the Conan stories are so good and so amazing, and I really wish they got more credit today, because so many people, like I said, they've seen the movies, and so they think Conan is some idiot barbarian who doesn't know how to behave. Conan in the books, he draws maps, and he sits and listens to philosophers. Now, he comes away saying, okay, these philosophers are idiots and they're talking in circles and using big words that don't actually mean anything, which in my opinion, that's what I think of a lot of philosophers too, personally. So yeah, I got all dolled up today. I bought jewelry specifically to do this video so that I could just gush about Robert E. Howard and Conan for a while, because these stories deserve so much credit, so much more credit than they get. And, you know, J.R.R. Tolkien set out to create a mythos for England, which he did. The Silmarillion is an absolutely staggering achievement, but I think I respect it more than I like it. I've never actually read Lord of the Rings, let alone the Silmarillion. But I love what Howard did. Howard created a world where civilization rises and falls. He doesn't necessarily make a creation mythos the way Tolkien is, so the two aren't totally comparable. But he created a timeline of, you know, the fall of Atlantis leading to an age of barbarism as humanity has to rise up from the shadows again, from a new dark age. Well, not a new dark age, because it was before our dark age. But humanity has to rise, and then it reaches a pinnacle and before it falls. And okay, so the Phoenix on the Sword, as I've mentioned, the original Conan story, is technically, not even technically, it just is. It's a rewrite of the Cull of Atlantis story by this Axe I Rule. There were some changes made, but at the same time, if you've read both, it's undeniable. They're pretty much the same story. And the thing was, when Howard tried to publish the Cull stories, he basically realized they weren't very popular because it was too far back in history. There was nothing readers could really glom onto because it was just too far out. So Cull is in the decline of civilization. He comes from Atlantis, which is a golden... Hang on. He comes from Atlantis. Well, he's exiled from Atlantis, which is the shining peak of civilization. But at the same time, as you read the Cull stories, and there were more written than were published because Howard liked the character, but you see Cull's world is civilization is declining. You're on your way to a cataclysm that will destroy the world and take it to a dark age. Whereas Conan is on the mirror end, where civilization is coming up, it's rising, and we see that the stories are all connected. Like, Howard created one of the original multiverses, in that you see mention of Conan in his short stories that take place further in the future. His Pictish king, Bran Mak Morn, uh, meets Kull of Atlantis, because Kull doesn't actually die. Kull just wanders into the mist of time, which is a very fitting end for Kull. If you read the Kull stories, you get to that point and you're like, that fits. Kull is also asexual. I just want to mention that. Like, obviously, Howard doesn't use that word because I'm sure it existed at the time, but like, he wouldn't have had that wording. But like, if you actually read the Kull stories, the way he talks about women and everything, it's just, he's asexual. There's absolutely no denying it, which is interesting when you contrast it with the fact that, you know, Conan stories are considered to be so sexual. But again, Howard was writing to try and get that cover story bonus with, with Weird Tales, with his Conan stories. Would you stop hissing at me? I don't know if the camera will pick it up, but my cup keeps hissing. But yeah, although I will say, it's in the 90s they did a Kull movie starring Kevin Sorbo, whatever it is. The movie sucks. It's awful. They stole storylines from the Kull story. The Conan movie steal elements from the Kull stories. The Kull stories steal from the Conan stories. The Kull movie steals from the Conan stories. It's extremely annoying. Just, oh my god. I haven't even seen the Solomon Kane movie. Oh, that's what I was going to say. So, the Kull movie completely erases the asexuality in favor of giving him a really generic love interest. And it doesn't even follow through on... You think it's building up to like a lesbian kiss at the end, and they don't even do it. And I mean, by that point, the villain has turned into a horrific monster, so it's not like it would be sexy at all anyway. I haven't even seen the Solomon Kane movie. I have a friend who Solomon Kane is his favorite Howard character, and he saw it and just... he showed me the trailer, and I was like, oh my god, how do you keep getting Howard so wrong? I think Netflix had I believe Netflix had the rights to Conan for a bit, and they were developing a series, but Conan nowadays is seen as being extremely kind of toxic masculinity, which is so annoying, because that's not the character. It's just not. And like I said, it's so heartbreaking that Howard does not get the recognition that like Lovecraft is still considered controversial, but we still can't... He's the one with the Barnes & Noble special editions, which is great, obviously, but like, look, I'm very glad I have the Del Rey books, but they're not the same as pretty hardbound Barnes & Noble editions. Why can't I have those? Why can't I have pretty leather-bound Conan books to sit on my shelf like the trophies they are? Am I really asking too much? But yeah, you go into any bookstore, you'll be able to find Lovecraft, most likely. Especially a Barnes & Noble or something. You'll find Lovecraft. You'll quite possibly usually be able to find at least something Edgar Rice Burroughs. But Howard, not likely, unfortunately. And I think that's a huge disservice to a writer who did incredible work and who absolutely deserves so much credit, so much more credit than he gets. In Seattle, they have Mopop, which is the Museum of Pop Culture. And they have a sci-fi and fantasy wall of fame in their first level. They have Lovecraft, they have Edgar Rice Burroughs, they have George Lucas, and all these other... They have C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. but they don't have Robert E. Howard. They have a replica prop of Conan's sword from the 80s movie, but Robert E. Howard doesn't even make it onto the Sci-Fi Fantasy Wall of Fame at the Museum of Pop Culture. They have an entire exhibit on Magic the Gathering because Magic the Gathering sponsors it. Magic the Gathering and D&D and all these things take so much from Howard's work that they don't even know because they're so fundamental. It's the same way so much fantasy is built on the work of Tolkien. And Tolkien gets credit. Well, I mean, some people try to claim that Tolkien's work is boring because his elements have been so used nowadays by so many other authors, including inferior authors who didn't know how to work with the tools that Tolkien did. But Howard doesn't get anything. Howard does not get any of that recognition. There's like one biography about him that is considered to be decent. Barnes & Noble can't even order it for me because it's not in their system at all. And this is kind of a sad note to end on, but it also feels like Howard's life itself, you know. I think I mentioned Howard died by suicide because I don't know if he was depressed. Obviously, I can't diagnose that. But it was clear that Howard did have, I have no doubt he had some kind of mental health issue. And after his mother slipped into a coma and he was told there was no chance, there was very, very little chance that she would come out of it, he saw no point in living after that. And sadly, he took his own life, which for a man who wrote the way he did, he's this incredible figure because he's such a contrast. You know, I said people tend to disregard Conan as an example of toxic masculinity, but Howard is such a contrast because he was a boxer, he was a fighter, he was very much a manly man of his time, he was a Texan, he had to be. And after World War I, you know, he saw the world change from when he was born in 1906 to his death in 1936. And it's clear that affected him. So yes, he was a manly man, but he was also a poet. And you can see his poetry throughout the stories of Conan and his other work, and it very much reflects in the writing in the Conan stories. His writing is absolutely beautiful, in my opinion. It's breezy and easy, and granted, it's an older form of language. So like, if you're not used to that kind of language, it can take a little bit to adjust to. But it's the same as reading Jane Austen. If you take the time to look up words you don't know and take time to acclimate to it, the writing is absolutely incredible. And it's a glimpse into another time. In the case of Conan, it's a glimpse into a fictional age undreamed of. But even those stories and the way it is an age of dreamed of, like I said, is fictional, but it was intended to lead into our own world. And that's why, like I said, even Howard's characters who were written closer to his own time, along the timeline, they have mentions of Bran Mak Morn and Conan, and even Lovecraft stories, which were contemporary for the time, they're also set in the same universe. It wasn't that they intended to create a shared universe. That I did not intend to go on this long. And I was planning to just focus on Conan, but here I am talking about Howard because whatever, I'm a Howard fangirl, let's just admit it. But this, it wasn't meant to be a multiverse or anything. It was just a bunch of friends who were just writing together, and they saw something cool and they wanted to incorporate an element of what their friend was doing. One of the most recognizable features from the Cthulhu mythos is, of course, the book The Necronomicon, which modern fantasy has certainly had fun with that. I hate hearing gamers who are like, oh yeah, I read the Necronomicon, and I'm like, no you didn't. No you didn't, because you can't read the Necronomicon without going mad, you idiot. It's like that joke about the scientist claiming to have invented an acid that eats through everything, but then saying they'll bring their friend a vial of it. It's like, no you didn't. No you didn't. But yeah, it's just... Oh, so what I was saying... So Howard created the Black Book of Cults, which is also featured heavily throughout the stories. And you can't go far in the Cthulhu mythos without running into it, and into other aspects that Howard helped create. You could argue that the entire timeline that the Cthulhu mythos is built on was created by Howard. Do you see why I say the man deserves so much more credit than we give him nowadays? And it just makes me so sad that this incredible writer and this incredible creator doesn't get the acknowledgement he deserves. He doesn't get the Barnes & Noble decorative editions. He doesn't get movies that, he doesn't get a Peter Jackson adapting his stories into movies that are painstakingly and lovingly accurate. No, instead he gets Rings of Power. I said what I said. But yeah, if you enjoy fantasy, and if you can understand that these stories were written in another time, and that the language may be not necessarily politically correct by our standards, if you can understand that it was a different time and you can look at it with that grain of salt, but if you enjoy fantasy, I highly recommend these books. I highly recommend all of Howard's fantasy work, really. If you like horror, definitely check out his horror stuff. But I absolutely would love for more people to read the Conan of Cimmeria stories. Like I said, they just deserve so much more respect than they get nowadays. And I don't know, that concludes my ramble about Robert E. Howard and Conan. And all I can say is I hope more people check them out. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening. This was just supposed to be like a 41 minutes. This was just supposed to be like a 10-minute introduction to like the Conan stories and saying, oh my god, they're so much better than the movies, please check them out. It wasn't, I didn't expect it to be this, but here's what we've got. If you don't know who I am Song W. Erickson. This is kind of a return to YouTube for me. I've been away for a bit. On this channel, at least, I co-host a podcast called Two Women Talking with Liana Kersner, which is over on her channel. I am a fantasy romance author myself. I write a epic fantasy romance called Calidus Chronicles, which is, I don't know if I would say it's inspired by Conan, but I think Robert E. Howard's writing, and yeah, kind of Jane Austen was more of a influence than Howard, admittedly. But, if that interests you, check that out. But yeah, I'm a Robert E. Howard fangirl, and it is what it is. That's just part of who I am. Yeah, I think that's all I've got to say. I have a book, but the books I want you to check out really are Conan, or mine. Yeah, both. So I think that's all I have to say. So I'm gonna go take off all the jewelry and finish my grape juice. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. And if you like, give it a like. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you're interested, subscribe and hit the bell, and hopefully I'll do more videos. Like I said, this is a bit of a comeback. So I would like to do more just kind of talking about things that interest me. I've been thinking, another idea I have is the pulps versus modern fiction, namely talking about the idea of Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros as the modern pulp writers. So let me know if you'd be interested in hearing about that. But yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.